it can be frustrating when leadership says they don't have the time for crisis preparedness. They'll just cross that bridge when they come to it. It's nice to be prepared with an example of how that can turn out, and now we have a doozy of an example. It's coming up in this short midweek episode of For Immediate Release. Another fine podcast from the FIR Podcast Network.
This is For Immediate Release, the podcast for communicators.
And welcome to episode 321 of For Immediate Release. I'm Neville Hobson.
And I'm Shel Holtz, and it is time for another episode of Wow, didn't that company suck at a crisis response? I bet you know which crisis we're talking about. On February 3rd, a Norfolk Southern railway train derailed in the town of East Palestine, Ohio. And among the contents of the rail cars that it was hauling was vinyl chloride, which is a highly toxic chemical, and they started burning and created what can, I think, fairly be described as an environmental disaster. People found, especially after they started a burn to deliberately get rid of this stuff and evacuated people, and people came back and they said their pets were dying. Fish in the river were dead by the thousands. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency came in. The National Rail Transportation Agency, I can't remember what it's called. It's an independent agency, not part of the Transportation Department, came in to assess and deal with this. And it's going to be a disaster cleanup site for some time. Some people are suggesting that it's going to be years. There's not a final determination yet. They do take their time on these things to assess what happened, but everybody is reasonably certain that the blame lies with Norfolk Southern Railway and braking issues. And obviously, when this happened, you would expect the company to fire up its crisis response plan, but it would seem, based on how things went, that they don't actually have a crisis response plan. The PR consensus across a number of articles that I've read has been that it has been awful and inadequate considering the enormity of this situation. There was one piece I read, quite good, in O'Dwyer's by Penn Pendleton and Brian Cattell. They cite two critical mistakes the company made. First, early communications were mainly long-winded and impersonal written statements. The Environmental Protection Agency and the governor of Ohio were fielding questions from residents at an open town hall, but Norfolk Southern canceled the appearance of the people they were planning to send because they were concerned about safety. That's not the smartest thing I've ever heard. By the time the CEO, his name is Alan Shaw, showed up in East Palestine, it was really too late for them to recover from their lack of accessibility. And accessibility is something that you really want to be sure you're offering in a crisis. The second big critical mistake they made was that many of their media statements were unnecessarily defensive and tone deaf. For example, when questioned about the health impact, Shaw said, "If folks are experiencing symptoms with which they're not accustomed, I would strongly encourage them to go see a trusted medical professional." I mean, good God, really? After the National Transportation Safety Board report, the company took credit for assessing facts correctly in advance, and they churlishly criticized misinformation. And churlishly is the word that was used in the O'Dwyer article. This misinformation was the result of the fact that the story was really starting to cool down by February 12th. That's not a big surprise. We have lots of train derailments in the U.S., and in fact, this one is shining a light on that and might lead to some action to prevent that from happening. In fact, there was another one in Ohio just a few weeks before this. But when the story reignited, a Norfolk Southern company spokesperson said it was the result of tweets from activists that were amplified by foreign-owned bots. I mean, what a stupid thing to say. You really need to look at the principles of crisis communication. It seems that now the company is taking the PR seriously, at least as of Tuesday, March 1st, when a part of its website appeared that had daily updates and information for affected residents. And they showcase some of the initiatives they've undertaken, which aren't bad. I mean, they've donated $300,000 to the city's school district, $850,000 to the local fire department. They're reimbursing first responders $220,000 because of all the equipment that was lost in that immediate response. But still, the CEO, Shaw, when he was making TV appearances, looked rehearsed and wooden, which suggests to me that he hadn't been through media training. He participated in an interview on CNBC where he couldn't answer a question about legal liability and financial compensation. And he used lines like, "We're going to make this right," which don't mean a thing. And then he attended a CNN town hall where a lifelong resident told a story about how she just wanted to plant her tomatoes. He just stood there and showed no empathy. And, if you're at all schooled in crisis communication, you have to tailor your messages to the aggrieved party and note their concerns and not just stand there. Pendleton and Cattell in the O'Dwyer piece said that Shaw and his PR team haven't learned the first lesson of TV journalism, that the story is visual. Pictures drive coverage, they write. The controlled burn will be replayed to millions upon millions of viewers in the weeks and months ahead, or at least until another equally colorful and shocking event unfolds for network camera crews. If Norfolk Southern wants to control and eventually end the crisis, they need to create their own visuals, which I think is an excellent point. And why aren't company leaders out there visiting people who were affected in their homes? That person who wants to plant her tomatoes, Shaw should be at her house kneeling in her garden. I remember Al Tortorella, Burson Marsteller's crisis doctor back in the days of the Puget Sound oil spill, the Exxon Valdez, saying if he'd been in charge, he would have taken 2 pictures. He would have flown the CEO up there, had him on the bow of the ship with his binoculars looking at the damage, and then on the shore, on his knees in the muck, holding a dead bird. Just convey that empathy. He sincerely had it, but he didn't want to fly to Alaska because he didn't have his command center there, and he wouldn't be able to be in control of the situation as well as he could in his office. But perception is reality in a crisis. Now, to make matters worse, Shaw's been defensive about the company's action. It's fine to outline what you've done, but when people are piling on, you can't fall back on things you've already committed to. It's important to talk about the changes that you're going to make, and again, to convey that empathy. People are worried about whether they're going to get cancer 8-9 years from now as a result of this exposure, or if their kids will. Is Norfolk Southern prepared to establish a fund to cover those costs? They need to show a deeper level of emotional commitment to the victims of this event. Forbes listed its own lessons, starting with "Don't be hypocritical." Norfolk Southern presents itself as the backbone of the nation's economy, a safe and relatively green way to transport freight, all while resisting regulation and safety standards and looking for loopholes in existing rules, according to a piece in the Washington Post. Another lesson that Forbes lists: expect blowback. Shaw was unprepared for the questions that he got. Third, answer all questions. Residents left the CNN town hall very frustrated because of the number of questions that went unanswered, despite repeated attempts to get clarity on safety measures. Forbes also says an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Yeah, if they'd spent money on the brakes, this whole thing wouldn't have happened in the first place. Expect analysis and calls for reform. Be prepared to pay and try to make amends. All things that they have been slow to do, clumsy to do. Just yet another case study in a large company not being prepared for a crisis. And when you're hauling toxic freight on old rails with trains that, have brake problems. Man, who was responsible for not preparing these people for a crisis? It just boggles my mind.
Staggering is the word that comes to my mind. In fact, when you were talking, I was just looking online to see what the latest is on the topic of Norfolk Southern. So Google search results produce 2 clicks on the scroll bar on a big monitor. That's all they're talking about is East Palestine and the fact that workers are falling ill now. So they're talking about that. The labor unions say the cleanup site workers are falling ill, and that's what most of the stories seem to be. Looking at Twitter, they're big with this website they set up called nsmakingitright.com. That's what they say their homepage is now on their Twitter handle. All the tweets that I'm looking at, it's all about this thing here. So they've kind of got into gear with this, it seems to me. The website makingitright.com, easy to throw barbs at them, but this doesn't do much for me. It's a boring looking site, very stiff. It's not human looking. It's not at all. It's about them. Aren't we good at doing these things? This is what the message I'm getting from just looking at this. So just picture that whilst you were outlining what happened. I read the Axios report on this. It's actually well structured, bullet points. You can easily grasp what's going on. They said it, I think, well in their concluding comments, saying that the company was on the defensive from the very start and never truly owned the message at all, which led to more confusion and paved the way for misinterpretation. That's a pretty simple assessment, but that's what it looks like. They were not geared up for this at all. And your point about the example of the CEO and the dear lady with the tomatoes she wanted to plant, just standing there stiff and wooden, that probably sums it all up. So, okay, they've got into gear now. Arguably, you could, to be kind, say to them, better late than never. But that doesn't diminish the grief and the trauma that people have gone through in those days, and if they were responsible. It's actually, I think, a very tricky situation for this, where a disaster like this happens, and the rail company happened to be the one who were transporting these chemicals, and the accident happened. Are they going to come out right at the start and say, we're sorry, implying legal responsibility for it when you don't actually know what happened? I don't know the answer to that question, but I would have thought your example from Exxon Valdez about, the CEO being up there on the bow of the ship with the binoculars, standing there holding a dead bird, that's a bit contrived, Shell, really. I mean, really, it's not really authentic, but nevertheless.
But it's visuals that you can have from your organization.
But if they're not the truth, that's not the point. You've got to be there and be seen to be doing something, being seen to be, this person who's the leader of this company is clearly very concerned about all of this because he or she, I could see him or her there all the time. So your point about that guy would have been a good example if he had been kneeling down with her, at the tomato plantation.
Right.
But not if that is utterly alien to his personality, because that wouldn't work at all.
Well, then you get the executive out there who is more like that.
Right, exactly. So it's choosing the right person to do something that looks authentic, even though it's manufactured. But this truly is, I think you're right, an environmental disaster. And it makes me wonder, I mean, this is probably going slightly off topic, but you mentioned thousands of derailments happen in the US. We don't get those here. But we don't have trains that are like half a mile long or a mile long going across these great country swathes of countryside. So, presumably there's not a common factor that causes these things to happen. I mean, I tell you, YouTube is full of videos of train crashes in America, like, trucks stuck on the track and a train piles into it. Spectacular disaster, But you wonder about the regulatory framework about allowing, that enables a train carrying these toxic chemicals to go through towns like that. I guess that's okay until a disaster happens, right? So is there a bigger issue that needs addressing here, do you think?
Well, absolutely. I mean, from a regulatory standpoint, it's interesting that the 2 senators from Ohio, one is a very liberal Democrat who has held that seat for many years. The other is a brand new senator who is a Trump Republican, and they have joined forces to propose legislation on this, and they are in lockstep. They've been working together on it. It's very heartening to see. It probably won't translate into a broader, rapprochement with the two parties, but it's very heartening to see that, this is our state, and we are going to work together to make sure this doesn't happen to our people anymore. But yeah, this is one of those situations where you have businesses that would rather they did a multi-billion-dollar stock buyback a couple of years ago. There's money that could have been invested in upgrading their brakes and their safety systems, but instead there's documentation showing that they were trying to use loopholes and fight regulation that would have improved safety. So yeah, I think they needed to do much more. And by the way, I would say they didn't need to take responsibility, but they needed to acknowledge that it happened. And they could have done this on Twitter. They should have been tweeting every hour. Even if the tweet is, "We haven't learned anything new. We'll be back in an hour with an update."
Well, there's lots of case studies of that exactly happening. Of companies
of course.
who did that kind of thing. Like, no one knows what happened. We're going to find out what happened. Then almost every day or do something that there's a personal statement coming out from somebody. Yeah, absolutely.
I know Melissa Agnes, the crisis expert, tells the story of Emory University when the Ebola virus was erupting in Africa, and a couple of doctors and nurses were coming back and going to be quarantined at Emory, and they started tweeting immediately. She sort of hails this as a great example of good proactive crisis communication. Before anybody started freaking out over people who had been exposed to Ebola coming into the country, they were out there tweeting about, well, this is how we're going to handle this. This is how we're going to quarantine this. This is how we're going to keep everyone safe. They were anticipating the questions. They were anticipating the concerns. And again, why a company like Norfolk Southern didn't have a plan in place? You can anticipate that if you're hauling toxic chemicals, you can have a derailment. There can be a spill. You should have a plan in place that starts with tweeting how we deal with this.
Particularly in such a litigious country as America, right?
No kidding.
I would imagine.
Yes, this is going to cost them a lot. And I expect it's going to cost them more than it might have because of their response.
Yeah. Have you seen any comments from any of the communicators or anyone talking about the communication?
No, I'm sure there's an article out there where they're doing a wrap-up, going to crisis experts and listing them. I haven't found one of those yet. But, when I talk about crisis communications with people, I first of all list the ABCs. The public is risk averse. The public attaches little credibility to business spokespeople. Media's role is based on conflict. Advocacy groups are going to exploit your crisis to their own purposes. Emotion is at issue, not logic. And crises are characterized by symbols. And in this case, it's the image of all of those mangled, twisted tanker cars, and also the image of that billowing black mushroom cloud of toxic smoke. And then there's what you need to do, which is respond quickly, accurately, professionally, and with care. Be transparent and accessible, which Norfolk Southern was decidedly not. Treat perceptions as fact, which Norfolk Southern did not. Acknowledge mistakes, which they have not. Tailor messages to the aggrieved party, which they have not. Note the other side's concerns. Well, kinda and late. Make no public confrontations, which fortunately they haven't. You haven't seen them on camera having an argument with anybody. Emphasize your strong existing relationships, which I haven't seen. Do they have an existing relationship with East Palestine, with the mayor, with the city council, with the Chamber of Commerce, whatever it might be? I haven't seen them leveraging relationships. So, I mean, just an abject failure of crisis communication, crisis management.
Not good.
Not good. That'll be a 30 for this episode of For Immediate Release.